My parents spent my entire college fund on my golden child brother. 5 years later, they lost everything and asked me to save them. If you'd met my family 10 years ago, you probably would have thought my parents were great. Dad worked hard. Mom volunteered at church every weekend. We ate dinner together almost every night. Nobody yelled. Nobody fought. From the outside, we looked like one of those families everyone else envied. The only thing people didn't see was how differently my brother and I were treated. Not better, just differently. Dad always described Ryan as the risk taker. I was the safe one. Ryan dreamed big. I liked having a plan. When Ryan wanted to start a lawn care business in high school, Dad bought him a used trailer and a riding mower. It didn't last the summer. Dad laughed it off. That's how entrepreneurs learn. A year later, I asked if he could help me buy a reliable laptop for college. He smiled apologetically. I think you'll appreciate it more if you save up yourself. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Ryan needed a push. I didn't. That was always the explanation. Whenever Ryan needed help, my parents saw someone who was one opportunity away from succeeding. Whenever I needed help, they saw someone capable of figuring it out alone. Neither one felt unfair by itself. It was the pattern that hurt. Ryan changed majors twice. My parents paid the extra tuition. I graduated on time because I couldn't afford not to. Ryan quit jobs whenever he wasn't happy. Dad always said, life's too short to stay somewhere miserable. I stayed at jobs I hated because rent didn't care how I felt. The strange part is, I wasn't jealous of Ryan. Honestly, I wanted him to succeed. He wasn't spoiled in the way people imagine. He was generous, funny, the kind of person who could make friends anywhere. He genuinely believed every new idea would work. The problem was, so did my parents. By the time Ryan was 26, he'd started 4 different businesses: a pressure washing company, an online clothing store, a mobile coffee trailer, a custom furniture workshop. Every single one ended the same way. Strong start, big excitement, poor planning, no profit. Then another idea would come along, and every time, my parents would say, "This one feels different." I never argued. It wasn't my money, at least, not yet. Everything changed the week after my college graduation. Mom called and asked if I could come over for dinner Friday night. "We've got some family news," she sounded excited. So I assumed Ryan had finally found something that worked. I was happy for him. I even stopped on the way to buy a bottle of wine. Looking back, I wish I'd never walked through that front door. Dinner felt normal, at least at first. Mom had made roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and homemade rolls. Dad was talking about work. Ryan was telling us about another business idea he'd been researching. Nothing seemed unusual. If anything, everyone was in a better mood than usual. Halfway through dinner, Dad set his fork down. So, he looked at Ryan. "You want to tell him?" Ryan smiled. "I think I finally found the right one." I laughed. "Haven't you said that before?" "Yeah," he admitted. "A few times. But this one's different." Dad nodded immediately. "I think it is too." Ryan pulled out his phone and showed me pictures of a small coffee franchise opening locations across the state. They've already got 12 stores. They're looking for new franchise owners. The numbers actually make sense. I looked through the presentation. Unlike some of Ryan's previous ideas, this one looked legitimate. There were real financial projections, existing locations, a recognizable brand. Even I had to admit it seemed promising. "So what's the catch?" I asked. Ryan hesitated. "The franchise fee." Dad answered for him. "It's expensive." "How expensive?" Ryan looked at Mom before answering. "A little under $200,000. I nearly choked on my drink. "Seriously?" He nodded. "I know it sounds like a lot, but once it's running, it should pay for itself." I handed the phone back. "That's a huge investment." "It is," Dad agreed. "But opportunities like this don't come around often." Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Then Mom quietly cleared her throat. "There's something we need to tell you." Something about her voice made my stomach tighten. Dad leaned forward. "You remember the investment account we started years ago?" I smiled. "Yeah. Grandma used to put birthday money into it." Mom nodded. "So did we." I still didn't understand where this was going. Dad took a slow breath. "There was only ever one account." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "We never separated it." I looked from Dad to Mom, then back again. So whose account is it? Neither of them answered immediately. Finally, Dad spoke. We've decided to use it for Ryan. The room became perfectly quiet. I honestly thought I'd misheard him. You mean all of it? Mom nodded slowly. We've talked about this for months. Dad quickly added, this isn't because we love Ryan more. It's because you're already doing well. That sentence hit harder than I expected. I wasn't doing well. I was working 40 hours a week while finishing college, living with 2 roommates, driving a 12-year-old Honda that made a new noise every month. But compared to Ryan, I looked stable. Mom reached across the table. We know you'll build a good life no matter what. Ryan just needs one opportunity. I looked at my brother. He finally spoke. I didn't ask them to do this. Dad immediately interrupted. No, we offered. Ryan nodded awkwardly. I told them I'd pay every penny back. I believed he meant it. I also believed he had absolutely no idea how difficult that would be. How much is actually in the account? I asked. Dad answered without hesitation. $193,000. Almost 2 decades. Birthdays, Christmas gifts, bonuses, savings, everything. I sat there trying to process it. Nobody had warned me. Nobody had asked what I thought. The decision was already made. Tonight wasn't a discussion. It was simply an announcement. Mom noticed I hadn't touched my food. I know this isn't easy, but we truly believe this is the best decision for the family. For the family. I quietly repeated those words in my head, because somehow, the family always seemed to mean Ryan. Never both of us. I stood up. I should get going. Mom looked surprised. So soon? I've got work early. That part wasn't a lie. Dad stood and walked me to the front door. Before I left, he put a hand on my shoulder. I hope you understand someday. I looked at him. I do understand. He smiled, thinking I'd accepted it. But what I actually understood was that my parents had spent years believing they were investing in Ryan's future. They never stopped to consider what they were teaching both of us. Ryan learned that someone would always believe in him. I learned that I couldn't rely on anyone. As I drove home that night, I didn't feel angry. Not yet. Mostly, I felt disappointed. Because for the first time, I realized I had never actually been included in the plan. I was simply expected to understand it. 3 months later, Ryan officially became the owner of his first coffee shop. And for a while, it looked like my parents had made the right decision. For the first 6 months, everything looked like a success. Ryan's coffee shop was busy. Every time I visited my parents, Dad would proudly tell me how many customers they'd had that week. Mom had started posting photos on Facebook. So proud of our entrepreneur. Ryan seemed happier than I'd seen him in years. For the first time, I honestly thought maybe my parents had been right. Maybe this really was the opportunity he'd needed. Then little things started changing. Nothing dramatic, just small comments. One night, Dad casually mentioned that business expenses were a little higher than expected. A few weeks later, Ryan complained that food prices kept increasing. Then payroll costs, then equipment repairs. Every problem sounded temporary. Every problem had a reasonable explanation. I didn't think much of it. Starting a business isn't easy. A year passed. Ryan wasn't making much money, but he wasn't losing money either. At least, that's what everyone believed. Then one Sunday, Dad asked if I could help him move some furniture. After we finished loading the truck, we sat in his garage, drinking coffee. Out of nowhere, he sighed. I've got to ask you something. I looked over. Sure. If someone owned a business and they needed a little extra cash for a few months, would you loan it to them? I already knew where this was going. Ryan? Dad nodded. It's temporary. Cash flow issue. Nothing unusual. How much? Dad hesitated. About $25,000. I almost laughed. $25,000 isn't a cash flow issue. It's a serious problem. Dad rubbed the back of his neck. He had to replace some equipment. The bank's taking longer than expected. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked, has he shown you the numbers? Dad looked confused. What numbers? The business, profit and loss, cash flow, debt. He looked away. No, I trust him. That sentence bothered me more than I expected. Not because Dad trusted Ryan, because he was about to risk another huge amount of money without asking a single question. I think you should see the books first. Dad smiled. You've always been cautious. I guess that's a good thing. A week later, Mom called. Good news. The bank approved Ryan's loan. I felt relieved. At least they hadn't borrowed the money themselves, or so I thought. Another 6 months went by. Ryan stopped talking about the coffee shop as much. Whenever I asked how business was going, he'd smile and say, "Busy, nothing more." Dad stopped bringing it up too. That was unusual. He used to mention it almost every time we spoke. Then Thanksgiving arrived. Halfway through dinner, Ryan kept checking his phone. Every couple of minutes, buzz, look, type, lock the screen, buzz again. I finally joked, "Running the country over there?" He forced a smile. "Just work." But he didn't seem relaxed. He seemed nervous. Later that evening, I walked into the kitchen to grab another drink. Ryan was standing there by himself, staring out the window. "You okay?" He shrugged. "Yeah, you don't look okay." He let out a quiet laugh. "Business has been rough." "How rough?" He hesitated. "We're behind." "Behind on what?" "Everything." For the first time since opening the coffee shop, I heard genuine fear in his voice. "Are you going to be okay?" "I think so. The holidays should help." He said it more like he was trying to convince himself. I nodded. "I hope they do." Before I could ask anything else, Mom walked into the kitchen. "There you two are." Instantly, Ryan changed. The worried expression disappeared. He smiled, started joking again, as if the conversation had never happened. Driving home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something wasn't adding up. If things were really just a little slow, why did Ryan look terrified when nobody else was around? The answer came 2 months later. Dad called me on a Tuesday afternoon. His voice sounded exhausted. "Can you stop by tonight? Everything okay?" There was a long pause. "No, it isn't." When I arrived, I found both of my parents sitting at the kitchen table. Neither of them looked up. Dad slowly slid a stack of papers across the table. "Ryan didn't tell us everything." I picked up the first page. My stomach dropped. The coffee shop wasn't just struggling. It had been losing money almost since the day it opened. I made coffee for all three of us. Nobody touched theirs. My parents just sat there in silence, looking around my living room. It was the first time they'd ever been inside the house I'd bought. Mom finally broke the silence. "It's beautiful. Thank you." Another awkward pause. Dad stared into his cup. "The bank gave us a deadline." I nodded. I figured, if we can't pay the overdue balance by Friday, they're starting foreclosure. There it was. The sentence I'd been expecting ever since I saw those financial statements. I leaned back. "How much?" Dad hesitated. $180,000. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was impossible. "You don't actually think I have that kind of money sitting around?" Mom looked surprised. "We thought you've done well." "I have, but not that well." The truth was, I'd built a comfortable life. After graduating, I'd landed a good engineering job. I lived below my means, invested consistently, paid off my student loans, saved for a house. 5 years of working overtime had finally started paying off. But I wasn't rich. I couldn't write a 6-figure check. Dad looked disappointed. "We thought maybe you could refinance." I stared at him. "You want me to borrow money to pay off loans you borrowed for Ryan?" Neither of them answered. Mom quietly said, "We wouldn't ask if we had another choice." I believed her. That was the hardest part. They weren't manipulating me. Not anymore. They were desperate. The confidence they'd carried for years was gone. All that was left was fear. I took a deep breath. "I need to ask something." Dad nodded. "Anything." "If I had been the one asking for $200,000 5 years ago, would you have given it to me?" The room became painfully quiet. Mom looked down. Dad didn't answer. That was my answer. After nearly a minute, he quietly admitted, "I don't know." I smiled sadly. "I do." Nobody spoke. Eventually, Mom whispered, "We never meant to hurt you." "I know." "We honestly believed we were helping your brother." "I know." Dad rubbed his eyes. "We kept thinking if we could just get him through one more rough patch, he'd turn everything around. But every time things got worse, we'd already invested too much to stop." I'd read about that before. The sunk cost fallacy. People keep throwing good money after bad because admitting the first mistake hurts too much. My parents hadn't just lost money. They'd spent years chasing the version of Ryan they hoped would exist someday, not the one standing in front of them. Then Dad asked the question I'd been expecting. "So, will you help us?" I looked out the window for a long moment. 5 years earlier, I would have said yes without thinking. Not anymore. "I can't pay your debt." Mom's eyes immediately filled with tears. "But," I continued, "I'll help you figure out what comes next." Both of them looked confused. I pulled out my laptop. "First, you need to stop pretending this can be fixed with another loan." Dad slowly nodded. Second, Ryan has to be part of every conversation from now on. No more protecting him. No more hiding numbers. No more making excuses. Mom quietly said, "He won't come." Then that's his decision. But you can't keep sacrificing yourselves for someone who refuses to face reality. For the next 3 hours, we went through everything. Every loan, every payment, every credit card, every asset. It wasn't pretty. The only realistic option was selling the house before the bank took it. Dad hated the idea. Mom cried again, but the math didn't care how anyone felt. A forced foreclosure would have left them with almost nothing. Selling it themselves meant they'd at least walk away with enough to start over. It wasn't the ending anyone wanted, but it was better than pretending. 2 months later, they sold the house. It wasn't easy. That home had been in our family for nearly 30 years. Watching the moving truck pull away was painful, for all of us. Ryan showed up that day, for the first time in months. He looked different, quieter, older somehow. He apologized. Not with some dramatic speech, just 6 simple words. "I'm sorry for all of it." I believed he meant it. Whether it changed anything, I honestly don't know. Some things take longer to rebuild than a credit score. My parents moved into a small townhouse across town. Ryan got a regular job managing inventory for a wholesale company. No more business ideas. No more promises about becoming a millionaire. Just work, steady, ordinary work. Funny enough, it seemed to suit him. Our family still isn't the same. Maybe it never will be. But one thing finally changed. My parents stopped trying to rescue Ryan, and Ryan finally stopped expecting to be rescued. As for me, I didn't save the family house. I couldn't, but I did help them stop digging the hole any deeper. Sometimes people ask if I regret saying no. I don't, because saying yes would have only delayed the inevitable. The hardest lesson my parents ever learned was the same one they'd accidentally taught me years earlier. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the consequences of their own choices. And looking back, I think all of us finally grew up.